Topic 51A, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1968. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to explain how U.S. involvement in Vietnam fit into its Cold War objectives and analyze how the conduct of the Johnson administration in Vietnam departed from that of prior administrations and eroded public support for the war and confidence in the government itself. In Podcast 47B, we learned how World War II ended European dominance in colonies around the globe. We also saw how European weakness and departure from these regions of Africa and Asia led to a power vacuum that was soon filled by the United States and the Soviet Union, who fought a series of proxy wars throughout the so-called Third World. Nowhere was this general pattern more evident, perhaps, than in Vietnam. French intervention in Southeast Asia began in the 17th century, like many European forays overseas. Jesuit missionaries began their campaign of converting locals to Catholicism, while French companies' trade into the 18th century was largely confined to the region around the Mekong Delta. During the 19th century, just as England consolidated territory in India and Africa, so too did the French wage military campaigns to secure more land throughout Southeast Asia. By 1887, the French established what they called French Indochina, which corresponds roughly to the present-day countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and parts of Thailand. While Vietnamese forces occasionally rose up against imperialist rule, France held the colony until World War II, when Japan occupied it in its own attempt to control the Pacific theater of the war. Wartime allowed pro-independence factions to gather strength, and though France did try to reassert control over Indochina following the expulsion of the Japanese, it was definitively defeated by independence forces at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The 1954 Geneva Agreements split the nation into North and South halves at the 16th parallel, and also founded the independent nations of Cambodia and Laos. The United States threw its support behind the right-wing authoritarian ruler Diem, while the North was led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist. Ho had declared independence for Vietnam in 1945, modeling his document after the U.S.'s Declaration of Independence and France's own Declaration of the Rights of Man. However, his communist philosophy led the Soviet Union and China to support North Vietnam. While the war that lasted between 1955 and 1975 officially occurred between North and South Vietnam, the involvement of communist countries in the North and capitalist countries like the US, South Korea, and Australia in the South made the Vietnam War one of the longest proxy wars of the Cold War. The North Vietnamese Army and their communist allies in the South, the Viet Cong, fought this war to reunify Vietnam. The U.S. fought this goal as part of its wider effort to contain communism. Given the quote-unquote loss of China to communist forces under Mao Zedong in 1949, the U.S. sought to prevent the further spread of communism in Asia. It sent its first advisors to Vietnam in 1950 and continued such support through the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. American involvement in the region escalated significantly following the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident. As the USS Maddox patrolled the Gulf of Tonkin, it sailed into North Vietnamese waters and provoked an attack. The incident provided the U.S. Congress with the rationale it needed to give President Johnson authorization to increase military presence with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. In 1965, regular combat units were deployed, and the United States initiated Operation Rolling Thunder, a 3-year aerial bombardment of the North. However, this same year marked the Johnson administration's departure from earlier presidents, who insisted that the South Vietnamese should be responsible for defeating the enemy. On the advice of General William Westmoreland, who predicted that the American manpower could defeat North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies in the South within 2 years, Johnson allowed U.S. forces to take the lead. However, the Johnson administration hid this fact from the media, instead emphasizing continuity with previous strategy. This deception contributed to what became known as the credibility gap between what Washington told the American public and the truth. This credibility gap had a profound impact in turning American opinion from those largely supportive of the war in 1965 to primarily against it by 1968. The other main factor in Americans' waning support for the war in Vietnam came in the wake of the Tet Offensive of 1968. Named for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year when it was launched, Tet was a massive onslaught by the North into South Vietnam. Although the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies were initially caught off guard by the Tet Offensive, they eventually routed the communists soundly. Nevertheless, the failure of American intelligence to predict the offensive and its initial success disproved the Johnson administration's claims that we were winning the war and contributed to the increasing credibility gap. Moreover, it caused Johnson's approval ratings to plummet and led to his declining to run for re-election in 1968. In the following podcast, we'll pick up in 1968 and trace the history of the rest of the Vietnam War. For now, review the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you can't do so, go back to the beginning, listen and watch again, and pause as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of these learning objectives. Good luck, and see you in the next podcast.